from Normandy. It's sunny but it's cold, and today we're going to look at the beginnings of the forest garden. It's quite a long film. It's probably going to turn into a documentary or maybe into a two-parter, I don't know yet. First of all, I'd like to thank Mary, who's supporting us on Patreon, and I'd also like to thank the anonymous person that bought me my first coffee. Thank you very much for that. It's really kind, both of you. Victor Hugo said that before we had books to tell us our history, we had architecture. But I'd also like to think that before architecture, we had chickens. When you look at your chicken today, and you look at the plumage, you might consider something that Coleus found out in 1963 when he was studying red junglefowl in north central India. And that was how the junglefowl related to their environment, because there for centuries farmers had practiced slash and burn, so the normally red grass and the dried leaves that the junglefowl were living in the secondary forest was often covered with scorch marks, and it's because of that that today you can still see the black sickles and the black spots on the breast, which meant that when these junglefowl went out to hunt in these areas, they were very well camouflaged. And if you've got a cuckoo coloured bird like Slippers here, who's gone broody and is a bit grouchy, but is demonstrating for us that when Coleus studied the grey junglefowl in Rajasthan, Mount Abu, they found that its habitat was the granite outcrops at the base of the mountains, and that the colour was very suitable for the junglefowl to be camouflaged while they were hunting for their food, using our fireplace, our granite fireplace, to show that off. So your hen is part of its history. It's telling you a story just by its plumage. So to begin with the forest garden history and how we got here, I'd really like to make that up, because the actual story of how I came to buy this property is so ridiculous that it doesn't sound real. In 1990, I saw an advert in an advertising paper for a property which was a farm with a little land in the county where I was born. That's in the middle of England, and I'd always wanted to go back to my roots. I was born on a farm there. We had 45 acres. I had an idyllic childhood. So when I saw that and the price, which was less than a second-hand car, I just rung up to find out what was going on. And unfortunately, it was a misprint. The people lived in my home county, but the property was actually in France. So I talked to my parents and we decided to go on holiday and see what we could find. We never did visit that property. We went right down to Biarritz. We came all the way back and bought that first property. In a way, you can't really get back to your roots, because your roots probably no longer exist like mine. And the other day I took a trip to school using the computer, and although when I walked the 2 miles to my school, it was a beautiful spring day, obviously, when they'd photographed all the area and the May was in blossom and it looked really beautiful. When I went up by satellite and looked at our farm, it was destroyed. The land was completely destroyed. All it was a big prairie with a lot of marks on where you could see huge engines had been on it. The woods had gone, the hedges had gone, and perhaps worst of all, in the neighbouring farm, a huge medieval forest had been completely destroyed. So what part of my vision for this forest garden, and I hope for your vision for your forest garden, is that between us we're all going to remake that. We can create within our little area a whole group of little areas which will remake our forests. So maybe, unlike Canute, we actually can turn the tide. When we came here, the house had not been lived in for decades.
maybe even longer. There was the grandmother of the sheep living in what is now our sitting room. And the garden was really just an abandoned field with the remnants of a cider apple orchard. In the early days, we were living in Scotland, and we used to be able to come across to this property quite frequently because we had a motorbike and could get on the ferry at the last minute, and it was very cheap. And in a way, we used the garden as the previous owner had used it. He was a bank manager, and it was his place of solace away from the madding crowd. And he would come here just to sit in the garden and grow a few vegetables and fruits. He grew them in hotbeds. We actually started to incorporate the manure which our neighbour gave us into the soil. And it was quite surprising how many things we could get on the back of that motorbike. We actually started with a hedging and with rose bushes, which we could bring easily strapped to the back of the bike.
So that was the beginning of the forest garden at a time before we were able to have the likes of Josephine here when we came over permanently in 2000. Up to that period we'd just been growing vegetables, and we'd put in the hedges and the roses, and later on we had a car too, so we were able to bring over some specimen trees and start the forest that way. In part 2 I'm going to look at 20 suggestions that I have for people who are thinking of starting a forest garden and trying to do it economically and without a huge budget. One thing that's really important to us that we learnt over the years is that it's better to have more land and less house. In a way, you're going to live so much of your life outside that the house really only is a shelter. It's not that important, so you can have a tiny house which you could actually build yourself on a piece of land with planning permission, or like we did, have a ruin which you can do up slowly over the years. Before we came here permanently, we'd sold our house in England and we were actually living in a tent. So there wasn't a great deal of difference, except it had a hard roof. So I hope you've enjoyed this film. I look forward to seeing you next time in part 2. All the very best from a glorious sunny day in Normandy. Thank you for watching.